Good morning. Please be seated and welcome to Mayflower Congregational United Church of Christ, where we believe that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here.
Our scripture lesson this morning comes from Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, there appeared to be Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Do not tell anyone about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Here ends the reading inspired by God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
This story has been told in 2 other Gospels. The story of the Transfiguration of Jesus. Mark has a version, so does Luke. All of them include elements that make progressives a bit itchy. This is a rather unbelievable tale with appearances by dead people, a voice from heaven, a shiny cloud. You heard it. I was not thrilled to have drawn this Sunday to be in the pulpit. Riverside church preacher William Sloane Coffin once said of preaching the Transfiguration, "There are certain stories in the Bible I avoid as I would an eye transplant." One such story is the raising of Lazarus. Another is the Transfiguration of Christ. I may have tried to trade Robin preaching Transfiguration Sunday. He declined the offer. But the joke's on him because it's his turn to preach on Trinity Sunday, and I have a long memory. What saved me is that this year we read the story out of the Gospel of Matthew. I'm a big fan of Matthew. He doesn't play hide the ball. He wants his audience to understand how important Jesus is and in whom company he belongs. Matthew is telling this story for his Jewish audience, and he is good at his job. The entire Gospel of Matthew grounds the story of Jesus in images, references, and themes from Jewish tradition. For Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses. So the whole Gospel is Moses-shaped. Just as Moses is born under Pharaoh's death sentence, so Jesus is threatened by Herod. For the last several weeks, Robin and I have been preaching from the Sermon on the Mount, which is another recasting of Moses. Just as Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, Jesus teaches the Sermon on the Mount. Moses interpreted the commandments of God in Deuteronomy, and Jesus reinterprets those commandments. You have heard it said, but I say to you. Knowing that Matthew is focused on tying Jesus to tradition helps explain quite a few of the more fantastical elements of the Transfiguration. In keeping with the Mosaic theme, Matthew includes the description of the bright cloud. We remember that bright cloud from the Exodus. That same bright cloud accompanied the ark and the tabernacle. Good inclusion, Matthew. And of course, Matthew also remembered to describe how Jesus' face shone like the sun because, of course, this had happened to Moses too. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai the second time, after receiving the second round of the 10 Commandments, the people were terrified because Moses' face shone like 1,000 suns from being in the presence of God. As if all these allusions to Moses weren't enough, Matthew actually has Moses make an appearance in this story along with Elijah. Here, Matthew employs an element of the beauty pageant to further ingratiate Jesus to the audience. Beauty pageants always have an on-stage question portion of the competition, which can make or break a contestant, and in recent history has made for some really great YouTube. Sometimes the questions are really dumb, like, what flavor of ice cream are you and why? Other times, the contestants are asked questions with a higher degree of difficulty, like, in 1 minute or less, what advice would you give to the Secretary of State to help solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? To be fair to beauty contestants, they have often given more thoughtful answers than the latest one. So I'm looking at 2 state and 1 state, and I like the one that both parties like. I'm very happy with the one that both parties like. I can live with either one. So this on-stage question is a little bit easier. Jesus, if you could eat dinner with anyone from history, who would it be? And Jesus gives the best answer, Elijah and Moses. The best answer, Moses and Elijah, they are the best Jewish answer offered. They are the big dogs, the greatest lawgiver, and the other, the greatest prophet in Israel's history. Their appearance to bless Jesus really sealed the deal for anyone skeptical of this Jesus character. So, okay, we've got reasonable explanations for glowing faces, bright clouds, and dead people. Our academic sensibilities are put a little more at ease. But now what? I mean, that might be nice for the original audience, but we're not the original audience. It's nice that Jesus can be understood to have such a strong connection to Moses and tradition, but it doesn't mean that much to us. There is, of course, the traditional Christian interpretation of this story, as more than one conservative biblical commentary explains. The Transfiguration story anticipates the eschatological events of the resurrection and the praise of Jesus, giving the reader, through the eyes of the disciples, a glimpse of the eschatological glory of Jesus before the descent into the mundane world, which will lead to the cross. Right, so we're going to say that Jesus is going to die, but he is glorified before all of that happens so that we can look back later to prove that the death on the cross was always going to happen. This is the kind of circular argument that makes people feel like they have to check their brains at the sanctuary door. On the other hand, the theological liberal understanding of the Transfiguration is that the post-Easter story inserted into the gospel narrative is seen as proof that Jesus' death and resurrection was always part of the cosmic plan. So the liberal response to that is, well, it never happened, they made it up, there's nothing here for us. Hence the earlier quote from Bill Coffin, as he said, it is difficult to make the intellectual and the spiritual come together with this story. And the reason that most of you are in this particular sanctuary is that when someone told you, just believe or else, you chose or else. So maybe the point of this text this morning is just a teach-in. You don't have to just believe, but there's not much else for us to do with this passage here. I just wanted to share all that information with you. This, of course, is a false choice, a trap that either you believe the Transfiguration happened or you don't. This is not an either-or situation. There is not a decoder ring for these stories. We do not retell them. We do not pass them down generation to generation because there is one answer, one response to be read once a year, then folded up neatly and put back in the drawer. So, what now? So let's start that long climb up the mountain with Jesus, Peter, James, and John. Or maybe you're already on the climb. Maybe you're mid-climb. Maybe you're in that place where you've stopped looking around because your legs are tired and your lungs are burning. You are not sure if you are just breathing hard or hyperventilating. It's hard to tell. Like Jesus, we are looking for a place to stop for a minute, a quiet place to rest, to pray, just for a bit. So stop. Right here. Stop. But is that really the safe thing to do? Stop, rest, and pray? I mean, then we'll start thinking, and that's a rather dangerous thing to do these days. The news, which at least for the moment is still allowed to be reported, is making us think too much about things we haven't really had to think about before, although it's not that these things didn't exist. We're just woke now, or beginning to be woke. Peter, James, and John knew something about being woke. They heard a word, an overwhelming word. This is my beloved. Listen to him. Listen to him. Listen to him tell you about nonviolent resistance. Listen to him when he says that things are going to get really hard before they change. Listen to him tell you that things are going to get scary before they get holy. This was a liminal moment. They were on the threshold of something. Oh, we know something about that too. We know about being on the threshold. We know about hearing an overwhelming word. We live in a state where legislators are trying to codify discrimination. Senate Bill 197, which passed out of committee without debate, allows individuals, for-profit corporations, government contractors, and even government officials to refuse service if doing so would be contrary to their sincerely held religious beliefs or conscience regarding marriage, beliefs, or lifestyle. We live in a state where women are thought of as hosts, required to clear decisions about her body with a man. We live in a state where there is a move to charge doctors with murder if they trust women. We live in a state where it's up for debate whether or not women should get equal pay for equal work. We live in a state where they've suggested a school grading system that institutionalizes racism. We live in a country struggling with how to live into our highest ideals, mainly that we really are a place whose welcome mat says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Our neighbors are afraid. Our school children are afraid, and their undocumented parents are afraid. We live in a country where protections that had allowed transgender students to use bathrooms corresponding with their gender identity have been rescinded. Our transgender kids are afraid. They are afraid. We live in a country where the commander-in-chief cannot deliver a complete sentence about nuclear weapons and who has repeatedly said that it is important to be unpredictable when using them. They fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. We know how you feel, Peter, James, and John. This is too much. They fell to the ground and they were overcome by fear. Who has the remote? Quick, change the channel. Pull the covers over our heads. They fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. The clouds are rolling in. Our vision darkens. So we do one of two things, even though they are the same thing. We fold up the newspaper altogether, or turn to the sports page. Life is short. Better to spend our time debating which point guard should be traded and memorize the new starting lineup. No, really, it's fine to do some of that, but not exclusively. To do only that would be the same as folding up the newspaper altogether to check out. It's what Peter, James, and John did up on the mountain. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. Overcome by fear. That's the root of the problem, isn't it? Sports ball doesn't make us afraid. So shouldn't we just turn off the news? When the church heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But there's that Jesus fellow who says hardly anything about what to believe, but has an awful lot to say about what to do. Get up and do not be afraid. I like the way Jackson said it. Get up and do not be afraid. Get up, rise up, and keep working. We're headed back down, boys. This is not the time to lose heart. We've got oppression to move against. We've got thin religion, lip service, and false piety to confront. We've got the empire to turn upside down. So get up and do not be afraid. And that's what they do. Jesus and the three amigos head back down the mountain, back into the fray, back where the rubber meets the road, where life would get difficult, where they would have to make hard choices between being comfortable and being faithful. Perhaps this is really why the Transfiguration makes us itchy. It's not the voice from heaven, the shiny cloud, or the dead people. It's that Jesus is clear as crystal. Get up and do not be afraid. Rise up. Keep moving. So how will they tell the story about our transfiguration? It might sound something like this. There was a time when immigration officers could detain someone based on skin color. There was a time when we built a wall to keep out our southern neighbors, but then we got up. Because if our country is to be a city on a hill, we must leave the door open to those seeking safety and freedom. There was a time when police could shoot unarmed black men with impunity, but then we got woke. Because if there is such a thing as the American dream, it only exists if it is possible for all. There was a time when women weren't allowed to make decisions about their own bodies, but then we marched because we decided that reproductive justice was a human rights issue. There was a time when we denied people the right to live authentically, but then we stopped being afraid because we know in our bones that we are all made in the image of God. There was a time when we were in a race to arm ourselves with weapons that would blow us all to kingdom come. But then, we listened to Jesus, the beloved, Jesus who preached, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now that's transfiguration. So, what Jesus said, get up and do not be afraid. Get up and do not be afraid. Rise up. Do not be afraid. Rise up.